The change was supposed to mean a fresh start. The kind of thing everyone calls a new phase, a new chapter, all those optimistic cliches. But for her it just meant silence. A cold, thick silence that crawled through the rooms like a sticky shadow. The wind howled outside, winding through the twisted trees, and the lake, just a few meters from the house, stretched out like a black mirror. During the day, it was almost possible to convince herself that it was peace. But at night, it brought something else. Something that lurked in the shadows. It was an old house, the kind that creaks with every step as if hiding secrets within the floorboards. The furniture was sparse, the decor minimal. It didn't matter. What mattered was being far away. Far from him. Far from the past. The divorce had left scars, and maybe here, in this forgotten part of the world, it was possible to breathe without feeling the weight of it all. But isolation had its price too. Sometimes the mind itself became an enemy. A faint creak of the door, a cold breeze on the back of the neck. Small things, but in the darkness they grew out of proportion. That night the wind was stronger. The trees whispered as if talking to each other, but it was the sound from the lake that made her heart stop for a moment. Something huge was thrashing in the water. Not a fish. It wasn't just the breeze playing with the waves. It was something bigger. Something struggling to surface. Each breath she took hung in the air. Whatever it was there. Present. Alive. For a moment, the terror was just a shiver running down her spine. Then she moved closer to the window. And there he was. The pale skin glowing in the weak moonlight. The eyes, those eyes, shining impossibly, reflecting the night like mirrors of a nightmare. The man stepped out of the darkness of the water, shoulders hunched, hair clinging to his wet face. He shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't even exist. But still he was, standing in the middle of the night as if time meant nothing. And somehow, everything seemed worse. Because now he knew she was there too. The air inside the house seemed to change. It grew thicker, heavier, as if each shadow in the corners had gained weight. Her heart was beating irregularly, her thoughts stumbling over each other. Lock the doors. That made sense. It was the rational thing to do. Her fingers trembled as they turned the keys, slid the bolts, pushed chairs against the entrances, anything to create a barrier between her and that thing outside. But fear was treacherous. It whispered uncomfortable questions. What if it's not enough? What if it's already inside the house? Every sound now was a threat. The wind scraping against the windows, the branches cracking in the distance, the ticking of the clock on the wall, too loud as if shouting the passage of time. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to organize her thoughts, but something was wrong. A persistent feeling that something was watching. That at any moment, a sudden movement in the corner of her vision could change everything. People say fear doesn't kill, but who hasn't felt that ice in their stomach, that certainty that something is behind you just waiting for you to look? She retreated to the bedroom. The door creaked as it closed, and the darkness seemed to expand around her. The bedside lamp cast a yellow circle of light, but the shadow beyond it was too thick, almost solid. She curled up under the blankets as if they were armor against the impossible. The house was locked, she repeated to herself. Some certainties are fragile like glass. And there was something in her mind that insisted on one uncomfortable detail. The water dripping from the body of that man, forming dark pools around his feet. The night dragged on slowly, sleep refusing to come. Fear had a curious way of turning every second into a dragging hour. But when the first pale rays of sunlight appeared at the window, the tension eased a little. The world was still there. Still real. And then she saw it. First, a single damp mark on the floor. Then another. A trail of soaked footprints, crossing the hallway and heading into her room. To her bed. The shock froze her in place. Her brain refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. Footprints. What? Inside the house. Her heart skipped a beat, then raced, beating so hard it felt like it echoed through the walls. The trail started at the bedroom door and ended right there beside the bed. There were no signs of departure. Only of arrival. As if something had stopped there, watching, motionless, while she slept. She got up slowly, as if any sudden movement could wake something still hidden, waiting. The floor was cold, damp, as if the lake had whispered its horror through the house during the night. Each footprint seemed to have been made with bare feet, the water forming small irregular puddles on the wooden floor. The smell of dampness was strong, dense, sticking to her throat. She touched the doorknob with trembling fingers, feeling the cold metal against her skin. The hallway seemed darker than it should be at that hour. As if the morning light hadn't been allowed to enter fully. The trail continued through the house into the living room. The couch was slightly displaced, the kitchen door ajar. Everything seemed normal. But it wasn't. Normal doesn't have footprints from something that came from a lake in the middle of the night. Normal doesn't have that feeling of being watched even when you're alone. Or maybe, just maybe, she wasn't so alone after all. A shiver ran down her spine when something cracked in the distance. The wood of the house creaked all the time, true, but now it felt different. As if it was a warning. She didn't know what she was expecting to find, but she knew she couldn't stay there. Because if something entered her house without opening the doors, then maybe, just maybe, it had never really left. Fear has a curious way of infiltrating. It starts small, a whisper, a shiver down the neck, then grows, spreads until it takes over every thought. She followed the trail of footprints, careful steps, shallow breath, as if any noise could attract whatever might still be there. The dampness saturated the air, the smell of lake water mixing with the surroundings like an invisible intruder. With each dark mark on the floor, the certainty grew stronger. It wasn't a dream. The living room seemed untouched, but the kitchen door was open just enough for a sliver of shadow to stretch across the floor. The rising sun tried to dissipate the darkness, but it couldn't reach all the corners. She stopped before the door, her fingers hesitating before pushing it fully open. The silence in the room was almost deafening. The kitchen was empty. No sign of presence, of movement. But the floor near the sink was still wet. A detail, almost imperceptible, made her stomach turn. The dish towel hanging from the stove handle hadn't been there the night before. It was a small detail, but she knew. She was certain. Whatever had entered that house wasn't just passing through. It had time. Time to walk, observe, and touch things. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She didn't know what was worse, the possibility of being hunted or the possibility of already being chosen. The lake outside remained still, as if waiting. The wind shook the trees, but the water stayed perfectly still. No ripples, no trace of what had happened the night before. Just the distorted reflection of the house and the surrounding forest. But then, for a brief moment, she noticed something different there. Something that shouldn't have been reflected. True terror doesn't need answers. It hides in the empty spaces, in the small details the mind insists on ignoring. She stood there, frozen, her eyes fixed on the reflection in the lake. The image wavered slightly, but something there was wrong. Her heart pounded in her chest, and then, in a moment of pure horror, she realized. There was someone beside her in the reflection. Tall, motionless, pale as the moon itself. The fear took over her before she could even turn around. The air grew heavier, the hairs on her neck stood on end. Everything around her seemed to distort, to compress, as if time itself hesitated. The silence was broken by a low, wet sound, something moving very close, too close. Her breathing became a choked noise, her dry mouth unable to scream. The world became small, claustrophobic, and then something cold brushed against her skin. And that's when she understood. It didn't matter what it was. It didn't matter where it came from. The only thing that really mattered was that it had never left. It had been there all along, in the bedroom, in the hallway, in the kitchen. Watching. Waiting. Night can hide many things, but some refuse to disappear with the dawn. Now tell me, did you lock the doors well tonight? Are you sure you're alone? Fear has a strange way of playing with us, doesn't it? But maybe, just maybe, it has a reason. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's so much more waiting for you, in the dark.